Korean War was a very difficult business at first. The regular army had to take all the blows of the North Koreans. I arrived in Korea in 1951. I was in a clearing company for a couple of months, and then because I'd had 3 years of surgery, I was moved to the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, the 8055. This was just dozens of men coming in when the fight was heavy. The ambulances coming up on a regular basis, the helicopters coming in, and so you saw really just a massive onslaught of wounded. When they came in, they were stunned, really. They'd been wounded, they'd seen the fellow soldiers around them injured, and they were pretty much stunned. When I first got there, it was really a shock to see young boys, some with wounds anywhere on the body, some torn apart badly, some in desperate condition, some okay. But the resilience of those young boys was also astonishing. I think all of us took the same position. If those young boys can stay in combat and endure that and see the fellows around them, I certainly can do my job. So I was surrounded by people who knew their job and did their jobs well. I was impressed with the enlisted men, the corpsmen. The corpsmen were just wonderful people in helping you take care of a patient, both in the operating room and in the pre- and post-operative units. Most of the nurses were regular Army, and they really knew their job. We treated them with great respect because they deserved it. It's hard to imagine how a loving God can allow things like war to happen. That's very difficult for me to understand. I think everybody has questions, and I have maybe more than most. But I look back on it and I just think he has to be there, but how can he allow it to happen? Well, it's a part of that's man-made. I mean, men are responsible for war. I left Korea, and I think we all did, a little bit older than when we came in, a little more serious. You tried to recognize what was important.
Several years ago, the Society for Vascular Surgery decided to put together a video archive interviewing leaders in vascular surgery, including the past presidents of the vascular societies and early pioneers of vascular surgery, innovators, and also honorary members who were from other countries, to have these records so that people could go back and look through the development of vascular surgery. And today we have with us Milt Weinberg, who practiced in Chicago in the beginning of the training in the 1950s, and we are together with him with Jim Yao, who's the backbone of the History Project, and John White, who knows Milt well and works at Lutheran General Hospital, where he's the chief of surgery, where Milt was too. So welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us about your upbringing in South Carolina to get started.
I was born in Sumter, South Carolina, not the fort. It was about 80 miles due west of Charleston. And a little farm community of about 8 to 10,000 people. It was as I look back on it, it was an idyllic life. I delivered papers that could cover the whole town in an afternoon after school. And my aunt taught math in high school, and all of my classmates had their parents were teachers, and we were in everybody's home in town practically at one time or another.
How big a town was it?
8 or 9,000 people, something like. It was a county seat. We had 100 people in my high school class, which I thought was an enormous number at the time. But it was almost an idyllic way to grow up.
So it was a different time in the 20s and 30s?
Easy, nobody locked the door. My father was a doctor. He graduated from Johns Hopkins in 1914. He was born in 1986. And he came to South Carolina about 2 years after leaving Hopkins. And he was a urologist. He had a heart attack when he was 48, came back to work, and then had another attack and was totally disabled. There was no money around. This was a depression, but the fact that we didn't have any was okay. Nobody else did. And it was just a wonderful time to grow up, and I can't remember anything but pleasant times, good friends, and a wonderful town to be in.
So Raleigh-Durham and Duke University wasn't too far away.
About 200 miles north of us. My father knew some of the faculty at Duke, which is why we applied to Duke to go to medical school, to go to college, and then hopefully to medical school there. And I graduated from high school in 1941, was accepted at Duke, and started that year.
And then those were the war years.
The World War II started in December, on December 7th, of course. I was sitting in the dorm with the radio on, and somewhere around 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock in the morning, we got the news about it. And I think I told you earlier, there was a lot of panic in the air. The Rose Bowl was played in Durham that year, not in California.
Which is just remarkable, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
But that they didn't want a stadium full of people out in California. There just was no...
And it was a month afterward, and so things were probably in a panic, weren't they? Yeah.
In any case, it didn't affect us so much in school that year. Finished the year, I was off that 3 months of summer. But when I started back, that was the last break I had in school and then medical school. In May of 42, then 43, at which the V-12 program came into being. And I went into the Navy V-12 program as an undergraduate. And then on the medical school in January 1st of 1944 at Duke Medical School. Incidentally, I know, Jimmy, in your questions, you asked if I applied to other schools. No, just that one. The tuition, incidentally, was $45 a semester. Changed a little bit since then. But medical school started in January of 1944, and I finished in December, going straight through December of 1946.
And then where along the line did you decide to go into surgery?
In medical school, I thought at first I'd go into pediatrics because I had medicine, then pediatrics, and then surgery last of the three, and I knew right then I wanted to go to surgery. And so I applied for the surgical internship at that time and was accepted. That internship didn't start until July 1st of 47. So I had an interim internship in Baltimore at a little hospital down the street from Hopkins. It was Church Home and Infirmary, but a number of the physicians from Hopkins and from the University of Maryland came there. So that was a good way to spend 6 months. We weren't allowed to date the nurses at that time. They were very strict about that, except we did. So that was a good interim, but I had a wonderful year of internship at Duke. Tom Ferguson and I whom probably you know of, Tom. Everybody knows Tom. He was the only, we were 12 interns in that intern class. Tom was the only one who stayed in general surgery, and Jack Teasley stayed in plastic. All the rest of the positions were filled by men coming back from the war. So I was not accepted to stay at Duke, but I went down to Charleston and for the medical school there, and they also were full in the residency, but they said if I would take another year of internship, they would give me a position in the residency going forward if things worked out. And so I went another year of internship, general, rotating, and then stayed on in the residency.
So then you did several years of training in Charleston in surgery.
Right, and it was interrupted for military service.
And the next thing you knew, were you drafted?
No, I was officially a veteran, despite the fact that I was in World. And actually, I finished medical school on the GI Bill. So I felt I had an obligation, and I talked to Dr. Cradle, who was the chief. He assured me he'd have a position for me if I went and came back. So I volunteered, this time in the Army. I thought I had a better chance of being in a hospital and working in surgery if I went in the Army. So
And so you signed up, and then
I was commissioned in November of 1950. The war started, the Korean War started in June of 1950. I was commissioned in November of 1950 and inducted into the Army in Fort Sam Houston on January 1st. On January 10th, I was in Korea.
moved pretty fast.
Yeah.
And so January 10th, and it was cold.
It was cold. That first night, we were right in front of an artillery unit, and I had never heard anything to match that in my life. And I had 2 blankets to sleep on the ground on. So that was my introduction to Korea. We were just north of Busan at that time. All the North Koreans had come down. Then MacArthur took the Army back up. Then the Chinese came in November of 1950. And by that time, the Army was pushed back down to the Busan perimeter again. But a lot of that was purposeful. Ridgway was the ground commander, and there were a lot of North Korean troops trapped below the American armies, and so they dropped back, and then they were just beginning to go back up the peninsula when I came in February.
And so then you were assigned to a MASH unit.
Not at first. I was in a clearing company of the 25th Division, and that was a 3-man unit in which just back of the troops, and ambulance stopped at that unit. We moved with the Army, and ambulance stopped and had us work with patients where bleeding was still going on, to change dressings, to do whatever was necessary to take care of things that were going on, and then moved them on back. But I think in June of 1951, I was moved to the 8055 MASH unit.
Tell us a bit about the MASH units, because those were, it was a new invention around that time.
It was, the concept was brought about in World War II, and DeBakey and Shoemaker, I think, was involved there, but DeBakey was really the driving force for the concept of a unit which moved with the troops and could take care of casualties wherever necessary. The unit, it was all a tent unit. There were three sections. One was housing, the other was the surgical units, and then the storage for equipment and all of the things necessary to supply. The unit was built to move as the troops moved. If the troops moved forward and we were receiving casualties, and we received during periods of high combat as many as 1,000 casualties through the unit in a day, they would go into the triage area, and if they were okay, if they didn't need anything done right then, they could be put back in the ambulance and moved back to a fixed position field hospital. If they needed care, they stayed with us and were operated upon or taken care of as necessary. The movement was we had a wonderful commanding officer named Thomas Beeler. He was a lieutenant colonel. He had been in World War II. Colonel Beeler taught us all to take care of war injuries. He also knew how to move the unit. If the troops were moving forward, we would split the unit in two. We would keep operating until they set up in the forward area. As soon as they set up, then we'd move forward. If we were falling backwards, we'd set up behind and fall back when the new area was set up.
And then how close to the fighting was the unit typically?
We varied typically from 7 or 8 miles up to 15 miles or so. But it was an area that a distance that an ambulance could get to in reasonable time, and the helicopters brought the most serious injury.
Did you have some helicopters?
We had 3 helicopters assigned to our unit and each of the MASH units. There were 4 at that time. The 8055 was ours, 8063, the 8076, and the Marine unit, which was on the opposite course. We were the closest to Seoul. Seoul was pretty much demolished. The armies had been through Seoul, up and down, 3 or 4 times by then. A lot of refugees on the road. But we had all the equipment we needed, we had all the blood we needed, and
What kind of injuries were you seeing?
most of the injuries were shell fragment wounds. Shell fragments tore tissue, and there was also some bullet wounds, but the majority of the casualties were from shell fragments. The majority of the operations we did were a debridement of wounds, but also, of course, we put in chest tubes. We really didn't try to do anything within the chest unless we thought we needed to do it to save life, but most of those injuries probably died before they ever got to care anywhere. But we had a fair number of abdominal injuries, bowel injuries, and kidneys, the usual variety at any point. Some have asked about amputations. We didn't do a lot of amputations. I did 5 or 6 maybe the whole time I was there. We saw a lot of bad injuries of legs. The question came up, and I noticed Frank Spencer mentioned repairing a vessel. I never saw a vessel that I thought I could repair. Just because the wounds tended to be slashing wounds, there was clothing, dirt, everything else in the wounds. We would not have hesitated to repair one if it became necessary.
As you have been to the MASH unit, I want to know about your opinion about the movie and TV on MASH.
I liked the movie. The guy that wrote the book, MASH, came to our unit in January of '52. He came a couple of weeks before I left. I left in January of '52. And I have his book, as a matter of fact. I liked the movie because it was funny. I did not like the TV series because they belittled the regular army, and it was the regular army, to me, who takes all the brunt of the fighting when a war first starts. General Matthew Ridgway was the ground commander, and he jumped out of airplanes with his men during World War II, and we had the greatest respect for him. They also belittled the West Point people. Well, the classes of 1958, 59, and 60 were decimated. All those young lieutenants were just killed right and left in the early days of the war. So I did not like the TV series.
The rumor has that Dr. Grimsma from Columbia, maybe John might know more about, is a character or the Hawkeye in the TV series. Is that true, or?
I have no idea.
Yeah, my chairman, when I trained, Keith Reamsma, spent a long time with the author of the book. And although he recognizes it was a composite of several prominent surgeons, there were several direct quotes in the movie that came from Keith by his recollection.
Yeah. I didn't know the man very well. I do have his book. I also have a book from the guy that succeeded Beeler, his commanding officer. He also came in January of '52, so I didn't overlap him by a lot. But he talks about that. I'll have to look again and see what he says about that.
So then, back to Charleston.
Back to Charleston. And I finished as chief resident. There were two of us as chief residents that year. Charleston was a great place. We had the old Roper and the new Roper. They didn't like us calling it that, but Old Roper was a small edition of Cook County Hospital, and the residents took care of Old Roper Hospital, but it was just down the street. But we went back and forth from Roper Hospital, Old Roper, to the new hospital, where it was all private practice. So it was a wonderful way to hone your skills, and as you got more and more experience, you learn more and more from the practicing physicians at the new hospital. And I had two great mentors there. One was Dr. Fred Cradle. Dr. Cradle was a product of the University of Chicago. He did all the neurosurgery, he did some chest surgery, he did renal surgery, and practically everything around. He was a wonderful teacher. And then Dr. Edward Parker came back from the Army. He was a thoracic surgeon. He was a board-certified thoracic surgeon, and he was my primary mentor there. And I learned to take care. We had a TB stand nearby. We operated on tuberculosis. There never was a better teaching disease than operation for tuberculosis. You had to keep a clean wound when you did the first stage of a thoracoplasty, because if you got an infection in the second stage, the patient would surely die. But we did lung resections, we did thoracoplasties, crushing the phrenic nerve, putting air in the peritoneum.
So you became interested in thoracic surgery and then decided, how did you end up coming to Chicago?
Well, we were also interested in cardiac. Horace Smithy was actually the man who did the first successful mitral commissurotomy. he used an instrument through the left atrium, and he is generally given credit for it. But he and Manley Stallworth and Dr. Parker followed the trend going on at that time. The ductus had been done by Dr. Gross, then the coarctation, and finally the thing that was the real impetus all over the world, really, in cardiothoracic surgery was the Blalock-Taussig procedure. And that was being done there. And we did the coarctations. We put in Huffnagel valves. I don't doubt if you've ever seen one of those done. It was a ball valve that was put into the descending aorta, and it would allow for aortic insufficiency. And what it did was it allowed the blood to go forward in the descending aorta, but the ball stopped it from going back. It was done by Charles Huffnagel from Georgetown. And we put in several of the Huffnagel valves at that time.
So you could do them without cardiopulmonary bypass?
Yes, one we did in particular with a coarctation. That was a snap, because you had all the collateral circulation, and you could stay as long as you wanted to. But to clamp the thoracic aorta, there were instruments to hold rings, and then a ball valve in the middle with furrowed edges on each. So you clamped above and below, divided the aorta, put one in, and you had the rings already there, and the rings clamped into that rut. Then you put the other side, and the ring clamped into that, and you started the circulation again.
So you could do it pretty fast.
That you felt you had to do it in within a minute or two, and it was easy to do. But we did several of those. It was interesting because post-operatively, and the wives complained of it, because if the person had one of them in, talk near a microphone, that click, click, click. And if they opened their mouth, you could hear the clicking of the ball valve.
Wow. So how did you decide to come to Chicago? You were looking at other programs, probably.
Well, I would like to have stayed in Charleston, but it was a relatively small operation, and Dr. Parker and Manley Stallworth, who was a member of the SVS, was there, and they were, so I wanted a job, and I had just enough money to go to Boston and Chicago. And I went to Boston, and I saw to the Brigham, and I saw the doctor at the head of my list there. My brain is going. And Dr. Gross. At the Children's Hospital, and those two men, they did not have a position. Again, they'd had people come back from the war, and then I came to Chicago. Dr. Cradle was from the University of Chicago. At the time, my senior in Chicago, Dr. Fell, was there, and he advised me to go see Dr. Fell, as well as Dr. Adams at the University of Chicago, Dr. William Adams, and Dr. Willis Potts at the Children's Hospital. So I came to Chicago, and I visited Dr. Adams, and I visited Dr. Potts. Dr. Potts was just working in the dog lab at that time with those three great young men of his, Art DeBoer, Tom Baptist, and Bill Riker. And when I got to the desk at Children's Memorial, there was a note from Dr. Potts for me to come up to the dog lab. And Dr. Potts was holding a dog's leg while Art shaved it, and Tom Baptist was wiping blood off the floor, and Bill Riker was taking blood from another one. And they were thinking about going to cross circulation. But he had those three young men, and he really didn't have another position for a resident or fellow. Dr. Adams also had a group with him. But then I went to Dr. Fell, the old Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. Fell was at the old Presbyterian Hospital in Cook County. And he and I just got along well. He did a couple of Pot Smith operations. He did a aortic stenosis in a 4 or 5 year old child under hypothermia. And I forget what else he did, but...
Did you go and scrub in with him on some of
I
those
didn't
cases?
scrub, but I was there.
Yeah.
And just watched. And he and we just got along well. And so when I got back to Charleston, I called him and said, Dr. Fell, I'd like to come up. And he said, come on. And that's the only agreement we ever had. But it was the most wonderful thing that could have happened to me. Fell was a master surgeon. He could do a Pot Smith operation was not an easy operation, really. It meant making an anastomosis of about 6 millimeters in length between the aorta and the left main pulmonary artery. And it took skill and patience to do it, and Fell was a master. And he was the most wonderful mentor that anyone could ever have.
Then was it a 1 year formal training program, or was it 2 years, or how long?
There was nothing formal about it,
Yeah.
actually. I came up, he had made arrangements for me to have a room at the Cook County Hospital originally, and a small stipend. And it was a very loose arrangement. We never talked about time. We never talked about, had a contract of any sort. All the funds, incidentally, were from private sources of Fell's. And when I first got to Chicago on July 1st of 1955, I got in Frank Malloy's car, and we drove to Wisconsin, stayed overnight, and then to Minneapolis. And I had a week then at Minneapolis, and another week at the Mayo Clinic. He had made arrangements for that. So that was my introduction. An hour after, or 2 hours after I arrived, I was on the road to Minneapolis.
Tour of the Midwest.
Yeah. And that was a wonderful experience. I don't know whether you want to talk about that particular thing, but it was a remarkable trip. John Kirkland had done the first successful, after Gibbon originally. Gibbon did one successful, and then 4 after that died, and he stopped. But John Kirkland had done a successful open heart on a heart-lung machine, a variation of the Gibbon oxygenator, in May of that year, 55. Lily High and Varco had been doing open heart under cross circulation for about a year and a half at that time. I saw what was probably the last of the, Frank and I saw, what was probably the last of the cross circulation procedures. We saw the last dog lung and the heart lung procedure, and we saw the first case done on Dick DeWall's bubble oxygenator during that week.
Yeah.
And that was a wonderful week.
They still they have that oxygenator in the museum at the Mayo Clinic still.
It was a wonder, and I spent some time with Dick DeWall down in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
Then we spent a week with John Kirkland, and he operated on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. He had a full schedule of 4 or 5 cases, even on Saturday. But he did several open hearts and was a marvel of efficiency. He was about as efficient a surgeon as I ever saw. In any case, it was clear we couldn't afford the given oxygenator. That was a very remarkable machine. But the heart-lung machine that Dick DeWall put together suited us just fine. So we went back, and my job from then on was to get a heart-lung machine going. But I had felt support. I scrubbed with him. If we had a case scheduled and he came over and didn't want to do it, he had me do it. It was just a wonderful time to begin in Chicago.
And then you finished with that and then stayed on.
I did.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful place to be. The Presbyterian Hospital merged with St. Luke's in 1958, I think. I forget the exact date, but I think the merger probably was a little earlier between the two boards. But the physical merger was 1958, I think. And that was the growth. Then in 1968 or 9, the Rush charter was reconstituted and the medical school put back in place.
You had mentioned that Rush charter, which stopped being valid in 1943.
Something like that. Because of the Rush unit was formed, which went to the South Pacific.
Yeah.
Dr. Fell was in the unit. Most of the senior physicians and the middle group of physicians at the old Presbyterian Hospital and Rush Medical School went into the armed services.
So they went to the South Pacific, and then the charter stopped being valid because there weren't
Right.
senior teachers there.
Some of the staff went to the University of Chicago. Most stayed with the University of Illinois.
Mhm.
And we were on the faculty of University of Illinois at that time.
And then, how did the whole practice of cardiovascular surgery get going at Rush?
Well,
you lived through that.
Fell was remarkable in that he had also done, for instance, we saw syphilitic aneurysms
Mhm.
at the Cook County Hospital. Fell had done a number off the aortic arch, the inferior portion of the aortic arch, and the descending aorta. He had operated on a number of aneurysms in one place or another.
What graft material was he using?
Usually vein graft or something like that. Now this was 1955, and in 1955, I think in the fall of '55, the Artery Bank of the Chicago Heart Association was formed. It was in the Hectone building, and that was put together by Dr. Fell to take aortas, sterilize them, and lyophilize, taking the water out, taking the liquid out, and it was a freeze-dried graft. And those grafts were the main ones we used it to begin with. Shortly after that, the fabrics started coming in.
And then you were involved with that artery bank and wrote a paper about it several years later, analyzing where all those grafts had been used. So you actually have quite a memory of that bank and what was being done with it because you researched it.
Well, Dr. Fell was the founder of it, and I was the assistant director of it, if there was a title. In any case, we wrote up, it was formed in 1955, and in 1959 or 58 or 59, we wrote about the number of grafts. Some 300 odd grafts were given out to various surgeons around Chicago. The majority went to Julian and his group. Tom Baffis had a number of them doing the Baffis procedure in transposition, and various grafts around the city. I got a call one night from St. Francis in Blue Island from a guy that had been in, a doctor that had been in the clearing company with me in Korea. And he had a man there with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. And he talked me into going down, so I took one graft and drove down to Blue Island. And the only clamps they had was just the usual variety of general surgery clamps. But I used a broad ligament clamp for the aorta and then smaller clamps for the iliac arteries, and we replaced the ruptured aneurysm at that time.
So how were the grafts packaged?
They were packaged in a sterile container, and they were reconstituted in the operating room, on the operating table.
With saline?
With saline, right.
Were they in a glass container?
Yeah, they were.
Oh, I see.
They were in a glass container, and they were all sterile. They were reconstituted, and again, Julian's group did more grafts than anyone else.
Where did the aortas come from? The medical examiner's office is west on Harrison Street there.
It was, but autopsy rooms at any of the hospitals.
All over the city?
Yeah, all over the city.
And then how did you sterilize the tissue?
Well, that was part of the lyophilizing process.
Mm-hmm.
And exactly how that was done, I can't remember. Well,
Yeah.
I just don't remember. I mentioned that when I was at Fort Knox after coming back from Korea, we took grafts from autopsy at the Fort Knox Hospital, and under sterile conditions flew them to Walter Reed.
I see.
And I think that's where I met Ed Janke, whom I think had a vascular unit at the 8063 MASH unit in Korea.
But I was reading through the paper that you did the paper writing. I can see how that was going. And of the 300 there were 300 grafts used in 3 years.
Yes.
So it was a pretty active business.
Yes, it was.
And the numbers that you found were that there were 17 ruptures repaired, and 13 died.
Yeah.
And the others did fine.
Yeah.
And then there were 41 elective aortas repaired, and 30 of those did fine. How about that? Huh?
Yeah.
One of the unique features of the arterial band is the support by Chicago Heart Association, and all the surgeons in Chicago are all work together. Cook County Hospital emerged because there are more death in the county autopsy room, so they moved the bank to Cook County Hospital as a central bank, and then there's a little small bank in some Pasadena Hospital, VA Hospital. And the whole thing is really a cooperative.
It was. It was indeed.
It was by Julian, Gaser Detectors, you as the director, Dr. Fell, you name it, Dr. Potts involved. Just about everybody. This is one of the milestones to me in vascular surgery.
And then you had noticed that even at the end of that 3 years, the demand was dropping off for the homografts because people were using fabric grafts. So
Yes.
there was sort of a short lifespan of the homografts.
Yes, it was necessary at the time, but it was a good bridge from taking sterile material to material you could process and have a volume. It's hard to get sterile stuff at autopsy and have any volume to it, and have one place such as this bank.
People were using them for aortofemoral bypasses.
They were.
They were using them for hernia repairs.
Oh, yeah.
You had listed all the things that they were being used for. Femoral bypasses, a few fem pops.
Few is the word. Actually, Julian probably used the 90% of them. And Tom Baptist had a remarkable number. You know, there was no operation for transposition of the great vessels. And Tom Baptist's procedure, it was one of the toughest operations that I ever fooled with. I did 4 and lost 2. But it was a successful bridge in treatment of transition of the great vessels. It was a landmark operation.
So Ormond Julian was doing a lot of vascular surgery at that time.
Yes, he
As you
was
said.
doing it not only at the VA hospital, but also at the University of Illinois, and some down at the old St. Luke's Hospital as well.
Tell us about Dr. Julian.
Well, Julian was a bright man. He was innovative, and he had wonderful young men with him. He had, that time, Sam Dye, then Hussein Javed, and finally the two younger guys, Jim Hunter and Najafi, in that order. But Julian was the man, he was the organizer who put all that together. And he was aggressive and dynamic. His ideas were great. He is the one who popularized going through the sternum rather than the big transverse thoracotomies we made to begin with. We used to go in both sides of the chest, divided the sternum across the chest. Going through the sternum was a landmark move for that. So Ormond was aggressive, and he was an innovator of considerable stature. One of the papers I brought was a paper that I wrote with Ormond. We were competitors in a way, but at the same time, he also brought together a group from 5 or 6 hospitals. The Dr. Glenn from Yale, the head at NIH, the University of Chicago, Press St. Luke's, and Duke. All together, they pooled all the information in valve replacement. And that was on a government grant. And Julian put all that together. And that produced a lot of fine information in the use of in valve replacement surgery.
So Dr. Julian did all sorts of open heart operations and all sorts of what you would call peripheral vascular
Oh, yes.
operations.
And that's the way the residency there was set up. That residency was cardiovascular surgery, separated, and Ted Beatty was the original chair when I arrived there. Ted went on to Memorial in New York, and Ormond became chairman of surgery. He split off, rather than having one head of surgery for all specialties. He made each of the departments separate, and cardiovascular thoracic was one. General thoracic was a section, as was cardiovascular, but there was no separation of vascular and cardiac. And you were the first
Vascular surgery.
first vascular head.
Right, 18 years ago. So that
That long?
it went until then, yeah.
Yeah.
That long ago?
That was, yes, 18
I
years
can't
ago to the
believe it.
day, yeah.
Now, to their credit, Marshall and Jaffe, and maybe Jim Hunter, got their vascular boards. I did not,
Yes,
and Ormond didn't.
right, yeah, yeah, and Dr. Najafi actually gave me my oral
Did
boards.
he?
Yeah, so he was a part of the whole.
You know, this was a lot like thoracic surgery. Very few of the thoracic surgeons that did cardiac were board certified. And in one of the board examinations at which I was a guest examiner, among the examinees were Bill Glenn from Yale, Dr. Shoemaker, Ormond Julian, and who was the fourth one? There was a fourth one. None of those had thoracic boards. So they took their board. Needless to say, the guest examiners did not give them their board exam.
Then Dr. Julian selected people like Javed and brought him along.
Well, they came over at the time that the merger took place. Sam Dye and Javed were members of his group, and so they all came. Jim Hunter came later, and later Najafi.
Well,
But Javid and Sam Dye and Julian came as a group.
Tell us about Dr. Javid.
Well, Javid was one of the premier surgeons that he was a beautiful surgeon to watch. Nothing bled for him. He never hurried, but he was simply a master surgeon and one that I admired greatly. I learned a lot from him. He made a movie along with one of the residents in access to the last cervical rib or first rib from above. Anyone who watched that movie knew exactly the right way to do it. But he was a master surgeon.
And he, of course, is remembered for doing a lot of carotid surgery and developing the shunt for the carotids.
I learned carotid surgery from him. I'd never done it when I had come, and Dr. Fell did not do carotid surgery. But it was very easy to see what they were doing, and we had great residents, so the combination was wonderful for me. Again, we were competitors in many ways with the Julian group, but I learned so much from them. It was a wonderful place to be.
How did he decide to use a shunt for carotid surgery? Do you remember the development of that, or how that all, or was he using it when you first saw him?
He was using it when I first saw it.
Yeah.
I had no idea, but we use shunt entirely. I think more surgeons now probably don't use shunts, but I don't know that for a fact. You would know better than I.
Or you use them selectively,
Yes.
for some people, but not necessarily for everybody.
You use an electro.
An EEG and other
EEG,
ways to
right.
decide when to use it.
Yeah.
Right. You helped Cook County develop cardiovascular surgery. Tell us how you got started at Cook County.
Dr. Fell, when I came, was doing all of the cardiac work at Cook County Hospital as well as the old Presbyterian Hospital. And the primary patient load at County was pediatrics. There were no coronaries at that time. We had a wonderful, one of the leading pediatric cardiologists in the United States, and certainly in Chicago, Dr. Benjamin Gazul. And he had a wonderful practice of pediatric cardiac patients. He also was on the staff at Press St. Luke's, and then, of course, Fell did the mitrals and other adult procedures at Cook County. He was the only one at that time doing any vascular work at Cook County. He had been asked by the chief of the hospital to develop cardiac surgery there. And so Dr. Fell was doing all of it. It was wonderful for me. Again, Dr. Fell we would get things prepared for operation, and Dr. Fell would come over and do the operation or tell me to go ahead. But it was a wonderful learning experience for me. Gazul held a conference every Wednesday afternoon, and people from University of Illinois came over, from Evanston Hospital, from Press St. Luke's, all attended those meetings on Wednesday afternoon, in which we presented cases of congenital heart disease. And so it was a great learning experience for us. And for a young man like myself, it was just a phenomenal business. I was asked by Freark and Baker in 1964. I was asked by Dr. Freark and Baker. Freark was chairman of the Department of Surgery at Cook County at that time. I was asked to come over and form a department. And so I came in 1964 and set up the department. Tom Murphy was my first resident, or fellow in that department, and I could not have had a better one. Tom Priarch Baker asked me please to take him. He had another year, but he was driving them crazy, as you can imagine Tom might do. But I didn't know him at all. I said, sure, I'll take him. Well, he was the best I ever had. And Tom was a tireless worker. He'd get the junior residents and medical students up at the crack of dawn and had them working. In those early days, we were priming the heart-lung machines with blood, and we would get 10 relatives or friends of the patient in at some 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and draw 10 units of blood to prime the pump. But Tom got all that done and ready, and he was an absolutely tireless worker. The fact is that within 9 months we had an approved residency in cardiac and approved residency in thoracic surgery. And Tom was greatly responsible for that. But we did everything. And then one time I had Jimmy Yao, Bob Van Echo, and Tom Murphy on my service at one time. I don't believe anybody ever had a
better staff,
a
right?
better staff than that.
It's a wild time.
We had a good time, didn't we,
Very
Jimmy?
quick time.
We had a great time. We
Thank you.
produced 5 movies, and we did everything.
We shoot a lot of movie.
I remember an elderly lady, I started to say old lady, I shouldn't say that, an elderly lady in her high 80s with a big abdominothoracic aortic aneurysm. And I helped Tom do that. We had a moving picture of that. But we had plenty of material. By that time, we were beginning to do coronaries, just beginning, I guess, at that time. I forget when coronaries came in. It changed everything in thoracic surgery. Whereas there were mitrals and aortic valves in adults, and the rest were pediatrics. That was the group until the coronaries came along. When the coronaries came along, they dominated the picture.
Were you doing carotid surgery at Cook County
No.
in those days?
No, Friarch was doing those.
Dr. Friarch was
Yeah.
doing those. Bob Friarch was doing the
Yes,
carotids.
he was.
Oh, yeah.
No, we did thoracic and cardiac.
And then were people doing femoral popliteal bypasses for ischemia?
They were.
Yeah, back in the 60s
Oh yes.
at Cook County.
Some, I don't know particularly. It was an interesting, I did as few of those
Mm-hmm.
operations as I possibly could. I avoided them whenever I could. One of the things I liked was to look at the interior femoral artery,
The profunda
the
femoris.
profunda femoris,
Uh-huh.
because as often as not, that was partially blocked. And if you could do an endarterectomy there and clear that out, there was no need for a femoral popliteal. And one of the things that happened with that rush of femoral popliteal things was that we were finding people, non-diabetics, losing legs. And the main loss of leg in non-diabetics from arteriosclerosis was femoral popliteal bypass. Most of the failures that we saw where a leg was lost in a non-diabetic came from people doing femoral popliteal bypass.
So a failed femoral popliteal
Yes,
bypass
yeah.
leading to an amputation.
Yep.
Yeah, and that still happens.
And again, I avoided that operation as much as I could. And I grew very fond of looking at the deep femoral profunda. And again, I did some. And then when in situ vein grafts came along, I think that was a step forward as well.
Yeah. Then you had a very fond partner at Rush, Dr. Monson.
Dave Monson was absolutely the best partner anyone ever had. He was aggressive. He was a wonderful surgeon. He was just a fine man. And Jim, you know him well. Finer man never lived.
Quick surgeon.
Oh yeah, yeah. Dave was interesting. Harry Southwick was considered the nurse's favorite down at Rush for a long time. He was the glamour man there. When Harry left, Dave Monson took over. That was a dubious honor, but it was a real one with the nursing and other staff around the hospital.
And then at some point you decided to move to Lutheran General.
Javed and I, our groups merged in the early 80s, 81, 82, all in there. And Javed was the senior at that time. Julian had heart attacks and having difficulty. And Jaffe was then chair and head of the group. But Javed was the senior. He and I was a senior with Dave Monson. When he merged our group, the two seniors of us agreed to take a limited number of calls compared to the younger guys. The nearest to us was probably Marshall or Penn Faber. Penn about 8 or 9 years younger. And Javed and I agreed we would retire at 65 to give the younger guys a chance to move up. So I was facing retiring at 65. I would have driven Joan insane at the time. She was not used to having me around the house. And I got a call from somebody from Cook County, a pediatric cardiologist at Lutheran General Hospital, who asked me to come out and do that. And Jack Saletta was chairman of the department at Lutheran General, and he wanted me to oversee the cardiac surgery, and particularly the coronaries, and make sure that we had got statistical oversight of the complications and mortality and so forth. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me, and I left because I would have been leaving anyhow. At that time, I was 31 years at Rush before going out to Lutheran General.
And at some point, you were the chief of surgery there.
Jack Saletta wanted to retire from that. He had a physical problem that gave him problems, and he asked me to take it. So I think I became chair in I went out in 1986, and I think became chair in 1987 or 88, something like that. University of Chicago came to the Lutheran General at that time, and that was a wonderful association. And so we were on the faculty of the University of Chicago for 10 or 12 years during the time I was chair. And then after Jim Levette came, were they still with us when you came, John?
It was the last year.
It was, yeah. I think it was 12 years that we had.
Yeah.
All of the departments didn't have
Yes, Chris.
as good a relationship with the Department of Surgery. Had a wonderful relationship with the University of Chicago.
John, you had some interesting questions.
Well, bring us back to the first days when you got back from the war. After your experience in Korea and you resumed training, were you a different surgeon than when you were after you?
Well, I wasn't a lot older, but I was definitely older and more mature. Combat injuries are very special, or combat is a very special experience that no other. And to see 1,000 young boys come in wounded in one 24-hour period, it's not the work, it's just the seeing that come in is something that makes you grow a little older and a little more serious a little more mature, I think.
And a little more motivated to really
Yeah.
move forward your skills.
One of the things that I disliked about the series, TV series, they said, well, when you see all that carnage, you have to have those kind of hijinks. That's nonsense. If those boys can stay in combat and see people around them wounded or shot up themselves, I can certainly do my job. I don't need any other motivation than to see a bunch of young men come in all stages of being wounded.
So that gave you the impetus to really sort of hone your skills as a surgeon. And when you first started doing pediatric cardiac surgery, what were the suture materials that you were using?
Oh, that's a good question. It was all silk. And, of course, swage needles were essential. I think if you'd had threaded needles, you never would have gotten vascular surgery off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But we had that in the units. We had swage needles, but it was all silk at that time, and you kept mineral oil on the operating room table, and you
To
ran the
lubricate the
mineral
suture.
oil over the suture to get the fuzz so that it didn't have some traction as the suture passed through. But it was all 5/0 silk, 3/0 to 5/0 silk.
And 5.0 was about the smallest that you had available.
5/0 was the smallest I ever used of silk. And but we did all of the aortic and the anastomoses, the Blaylock shunts, pot smiths, all were done with 5/0 silk.
That's wonderful. And did you notice problems with the silk over time?
Not really. It's just when those new sutures came out, there was no surface tension, and they passed through beautifully. It's interesting. Javed operated on the chairman of the board of United Airlines for carotid, and he used one of the new sutures for the first time. The patient got just outside the room when the whole wound came apart because he had tied knots in whatever the suture was. I don't remember what it was at the time, but he had used the new material and just put 3 throws in it like you would with silk or cotton.
Right.
I see.
And the knot just came
And it
apart.
was Teflon coated and it came apart.
Exactly.
So, Milt, with the Chicago Artery Bank, after 3 years, fabric became available. What was the fate of the blood bank, and did you and your surgeons at Rush immediately adapt to the new material?
Oh, pretty quickly. It wasn't an overnight exactly, but it was perfectly clear that for aortic work in particular, we were going to use fabric from then on. But the bank stayed in place for another year, something like that, and gradually there was no use for it. And so it was just disbanded. It was all paid for by the only salary was to Naomi, the technician who did it, and whatever materials she used, that was only expense. Phil and I didn't charge anything for it, except for those 5 or 6 years I was at county as chairman. I was paid a little bit then, but Phil had never taken any salary, and I didn't ever. And that was the situation. There was a wonderful hand group from Northwestern.
Yeah, right.
County was a fascinating place. It was a tough place for somebody who didn't have a disease that people were interested in. But the hand service, that group, I mean, they wrote the book on hand surgery.
Hand surgery starts from Cook County.
And burn care. And it was all the group from Northwestern that established that at Cook County. Cardiac had fell, and there were other areas of interest that just had wonderful coverage. The others had a tough time. I don't know whether I should say this on camera, but Dr. Fell was making rounds one day in the men's ward. We were going over to see somebody with a mitral disease. And he looked over, he said, there's something funny about that guy, his physician. We went over there, and the guy's leg went that way, and the upper thigh was going this way, and a piece of bone was sticking out the edge. And apparently nobody had seen it or done anything about it. They sent him down. Callus had already formed on the area of the bone. And it just all kind of crazy things went on if it was an area that nobody had any interest in. At one time, how many patients they have? 3,500 about, was it, Jimmy?
When I was there, it was 3,000 bed. The hospital.
There were more in the winter than in
Yeah.
the summer because all of the guys all in the frost with frostbite came in. But 3,500 patients. It would have been a disaster if Cook County had closed. That guy in bed was an exception. I don't know how that occurred. A wonderful story. All kind of things went on. First time I ever did a triple valve, mitral, aortic, and tricuspid. I did it at Cook County, and we had just opened the new intensive care unit, and the doctor's elevator was on one side, and Dr. Meyer's apartment was on the other. And I brought the patient, it was a young man about 23 or 4, back to the intensive care unit, and was telling the people, helping the family with gowns. The guy was doing fine, helping masks and gowns and talking about infection and being so careful. When what should happen, Dr. Meyer walked right down through the hall of the intensive care unit with 2 dogs.
That's a famous story. That's true. Not just once, many times.
Yeah. One other thing that happened when we first got the heart-lung machine going for the first case, it was done at Cook County. We brought the machine over. We'd had electricians check it over at Press St. Luke's at that time, and then I called the electricians at Cook County. I wanted them to look at the connections with the wall, make sure no plugs were coming apart and so forth. And they said, Doc, where'd that unit come from? And I said, we brought it across the street from Press. He said, we're not touching that. They were all union. And at Cook County, at Press St. Luke's, there was no union. And I said, you know, if something comes apart, I said, somebody can die. I mean, we've got to be sure of it. He said, too bad. And off they walked. And then, so we got duct tape out. We duct taped everything to the floor and the wall. Miss Gressett beat us to it the next morning. She had taken all the duct tape off, and we had to put the duct tape back on. You remember Miss Gressett, don't you, Jimmy?
Yeah.
She used to, after any of our operations, she used to put a plaque up with the sutures I'd used. I don't know, some 30 or 40, I suppose, and they looked the ones Dr. Meyer used. Dr. Meyer always did a stomach at Children's Hospital on a Saturday, and Dr. Meyer probably used a dozen sutures at most, 20 at most. And so she had Dr. Meyer's, and she pointed out how few Dr. Meyer's used and how many I used, wasting all the county's money.
One surgeon I want your opinion on is geyser detectors.
Oh, Dr.
Would you tell us
DeTackett was
more
wonderful.
about him?
Dr. DeTackett asked me to scrub with him and make rounds with him for about a year as he was getting older. He was doing not much other than veins at that time, and occasionally he had me do nerve
A sympathectomy.
sympathectomy, lumbar sympathectomy for somebody. But making rounds with Dr. Detakic was a story in itself. He would walk into a room, he called all the ladies miserable creature. And then he'd come into somebody else's room and he'd say, Esther, or whatever her name was, you are so beautiful that if you had lived in the 16th century, you would have been burned at the stake as a witch. He was full of those things. He gave my daughter a waltz that he wrote, a piano waltz that he wrote for his high school graduation. I still have that, and it may be in that packet, but I have it somewhere.
He was a poet,
He was indeed.
Yeah.
a master of the limerick.
Oh yes, oh yes. But it was a real education to be with Dr. Detakic. And the library, of course, is named for Dr. Detakic. Up in the surgery department.
Yes.
And I think I gave all my bound volumes to it, if I remember correctly. But Dr. Detakic was a lovely man. His wife was a delightful lady, and but that was an interesting year with them.
You are number 82 interview we have done,
82.
or the 82, 40 or 3
kidding.
our past president.
Wow.
We had 20 honorary member, and we also had 5 or 6 recipient or award, and then
Wow.
the 15 contributor that's selected by us for interview. We all decided, the committee decided we should hear what the member have to say about the vascular surgery. I would like you to give us some thought about the beginning up to now. You've been a member since 1964. You have a very long experience with the society,
Yeah.
and I'd like to have you give us some reflection about vascular surgery. In the beginning is cardiovascular, and then heart-lung vaccine came, and then they separate. And now endovascular coming back, and then do you think the cardiac surgery and vascular have to be connected again?
Well, that's
Give us some thought about that. I also like you to comment about the DVD on the history that I give you, and want you to give me some feedback.
Well, the vascular surgery membership was wonderful for me. I had the honor of being the host at one time when the main, it was held at Northwestern mostly for the SVS, and but the membership and the people that I met and were friends at that time was just wonderful for me. And I came in relatively young. I was 27 or 28 when I came to Chicago, and to be part of an organization like that was just a wonderful thing to me. Vascular surgery is, I don't think they'll come together. Everything changes. When I first started in Charleston, we did all the cardiac catheterizations. The medical people couldn't find the vessels in the first place, so we'd cannulate the vessel for them, and then they'd put the catheters down. And at one time, Penn Faber brought in a pulmonologist who took all of the bronchoscopies away from him. Everything changes, and vascular surgery is no exception, the endovascular stuff. But if you look at the strength of the SVS, now merged with the international and one organization. It's worldwide, and I think it will remain an enormously important strength organization. I don't think just anybody does vascular surgery well. I think the extra time it takes to learn about it. A good example is those surgeons who did femoral popliteals when they really it's a specialty that I think will stay, and endovascular will take the place of certain procedures. Cardiac surgery now, very few bypasses are done. They're back to doing pediatrics and adult valves and a few odds and ends. So, but it was a wonderful specialty as it began as a specialty, and I think it will remain so. I'm far removed from it. I mentioned that I neither used CT scans nor MRIs nor PET scans. So they all came after my activity, my active practice. But it's a wonderful specialty, and I think it'll stay. What is it still a subboard of surgery? I know it's independent, and it's...
It is. It's a subboard of the American Board of Surgery.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not a separate board the way thoracic surgery is. It's a subboard of the American Board of Surgery.
When I had my boards, it was thoracic surgery was also a subboard, but it was so far removed from general surgery that I forget when. I have two certificates. One is 600, number 600 something, and my second one, when it became an independent, I got a new one. So it was 6,000. It's probably 9 or 10,000 now. I don't know.
What did you think about the history video, the series, the 2-hour series?
I thought it was wonderful. I either knew most of you or knew about you, and seeing those wonderful talks in the video, I just loved seeing it. And I'm going to run it through several times.
That's good. We always ask people for advice for young surgeons who have just finished their training.
I've been asked that before, and the only thing I could think of to say is take care of anybody that comes to you. Now, I don't know if the financial situation now is such that you can't do it as easily as we could at one time, but Dave and I think anybody that came to the office was taken care of by one means or another. And I don't know that I have any other advice. Take care of anybody that comes
I
to
think
you.
that's good advice. The other thing is, if you tell us about some of your other interests and hobbies and sports and
Well, up until year before last, I loved fishing. But physically, I can't do the fishing is the way I want to do it, and so I stopped fishing. But a neighbor of mine started me in a camera club, and so I'm part of the North Shore Camera Club. I was at one of their meetings this morning, and it has competitive photography. I do like the competition, and I probably spend more time on photography now in Lightroom or Photoshop than I do in anything else.
sounds fascinating.
It is. It's a great group. We've got some world-renowned members of. There's Central, the Chicago Camera Club is a mothership of which there are some 30 groups like the North Shore Camera Club. And we're all satellites of the main ship in Chicago. But it's been a great business. I'm still learning to use the camera. The camera can do a lot more than I can with it. And Photoshop and Lightroom are challenging. I figure I know about 20% of each, but I'm still working on it.
Tell us a little bit about your family.
I have, Joan and I have 3 daughters. Two of our daughters have children, 2 boys and 2 girls, so 4 grandchildren. One great-grandchild.
Congratulations.
The third daughter was a missionary. Carol was in Ethiopia for 3 years, and then Central and West Africa with the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA, as one of their representatives in Africa. She spent about 9 years in Africa. She's now mission director of the Presbyterian Church in Evanston. Amy is, 2 of our girls are nurses. Joan's a nurse. My mother was a nurse. My wife's a nurse. I have 2 daughters that are nurses. I'm an authority on nurses.
Yes, you are.
We had at Rush, we had a big congregation of nurses, some 500 or so one time, and I told them that, and I got a standing ovation. But I learned 2 things. One is, and the main thing I learned is, when you're on top, don't say any more, get out. Because I started talking about nurses training, and about 30 of the nurses leaped up shaking their fist at me, saying, "Doctors, you train dogs, you educate people." And so I slunk out in disgrace. But I consider myself an authority on nurses. Amy is married to a neurologist who's a very active neurologist in Denver, big group in Denver. And Sue's husband finished 30 years in teaching in Chicago. He's been honors physics. He's teaching honors physics in Scottsdale, Arizona now.
Great.
So we've got good places to visit.
You certainly do.
My wife worked for you. I don't.
Lucille was wonderful.
She asked me to be sure to say hi to you.
Yeah.
For myself, I was your resident. I'm very grateful for all the teaching.
I'm so proud of you, Jimmy. You've taken it right to the top of your game.
I want you to know you are the most liked and most loved and most respected attending a county hospital.
Oh my. I don't know what to say.
I had a wonderful time.
Well,
Thank you.
I thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. I'm greatly moved, Jimmy.
Well, thank you very much. We all very much enjoyed learning so much about what you've done and talking to you.
I'm so glad to meet you.
Yes.
This is a nice time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Walt. And John.
Nope, couldn't do it without you.